Hi, hello, welcome here. My name is Johanna. If you're brand new to this podcast, then thank you for being here. If you haven't listened to the first episodes, they are a series, part 1, 2, 3, 4, and they lay a really strong foundation for everything else that we talk about. So I definitely recommend going back to those. You can listen to this one first if you want, but don't discount those even though they're a little bit older. And if you have listened to all the episodes and you're like, Johanna, I've been there, I'm ready for more, then I'm so happy to have you back and I really appreciate your support. A side note, if you're listening on Spotify and feel compelled to leave a review, that'd be super helpful. I'm getting so much good feedback on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. It's just not coming through. There's less listeners over there on Spotify, but it would really be helpful for me. So thank you in advance. You can do it while you're listening. And it would just be awesome to hear your feedback. I really appreciate it. Okay, so I've labeled this episode Healing the Father Wound. And as you go on your personal development, inner work, healing journey, it might be glaringly obvious to you that some of these wounds and traumas and patterns and beliefs that you're trying to shift and heal and move out of are a direct result of your caregivers, your mom, your dad, or any close other adults that were in your life, which may be a coach, a teacher, an aunt, an uncle, grandma, grandpa, etc. Or it might not be so obvious, and it might feel like most of the pain came from romantic relationships or friendships or traumatic work situations, and we tend to put our parents in a category of, well, they put a roof over our head and there was always food on the table and we got to play sports, so I don't think my childhood was that bad. And that could be true. Maybe your childhood wasn't that bad and your basic needs were provided for in terms of food, shelter, water, care, toys, clothes, cleanliness. All of those things are amazing and definitely put us in the category of privileged as far as the entire globe goes. At the same time, what might have been missing were the emotional needs, patience, presence, the ability to play freely, the ability to make your own decisions, a general sense that you were cared for emotionally, a general sense that you belonged, feeling like it was safe to ask for a hug or ask for comfort or physical touch from your caregivers. And these are the needs that are so often missing or were missing for the millennial generation and maybe a bit younger as well. And on one hand, it really makes sense, right? If you think about the experiences that most of our grandparents were having 2 generations ago, it was war, it was famine, it was depression, it was survival, and it was stress. And that was what they were living in day to day, and more exposure to the elements and sort of mindset and the beliefs that they had there, which is a lot of scarcity mindset. It can be a lot of fear, a lot of mental toughness required to survive what they were living in, and that gets passed down. But then our parents, maybe not, depending on where your parents were born, had a little bit more of a comfortable experience. We started to have the internet and a lot of information sharing and different types of jobs and more access to education, etc. So there's a little new experience there. But now we are living under those parents, and our generation has massive access to mental health resources, emotional health resources. We're starting to learn and really see the power and the necessity of healing in order to create actually a better planet and a healthy generation of kids. And right now, I actually feel like there's quite a big obvious crisis point going on where the mental health of young people is heavily, I guess deteriorated is a good word, not supported. And while the stigma of getting support is less and less, which is amazing, there is still definitely an epidemic of all sorts of things, ranging from autism to ADHD to general dopamine addiction to not being able to manage our moods, depression, bipolar disorder, the whole thing, you know all the terms, right? And in my opinion, a large reason why so many of those, I don't know if disorders is the right word for all of them, but so many of those are manifesting is because of a lack of emotional and spiritual wellness. And that's probably more what was missing. And often we don't even know what that is because we never had it. So let's bring it back to the topic of healing the father wound. And talking about our fathers, which are a big one, regardless if they were even there or not, it's going to impact you probably in a really big way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to explain a couple different daughter-father dynamics or child-father dynamics, about 8 of them. and what that might have looked like, how it might now manifest for you as an adult, how it might show up for you, what beliefs it comes with. And I just want you to listen, and maybe some things will ping for you and you'll be like, yeah, that was definitely our dynamic, and wow, I really see that in myself, and some might not resonate as much. And then we'll talk about what it means once you can start to place these patterns and why it's important and how it helps us to heal. So starting with the overbearing father, an overbearing parent is usually very controlling. I think there's a more millennial or Gen Z term called helicopter parent. This is the parent that's like always hovering over the kid, making sure that they don't get hurt, making sure that they make the right decision. And so if our father was like that, then for a child growing up, you sort of experience this lack of autonomy, which can lead to struggling to assert your own identity. Because we're now looking for other people to sort of tell us what to do. And in one way, this can turn into feelings of rebellion and wanting to get away from this power or this thing that feels like it's really constricting us, and it can turn into a rebellious streak or a rebellious phase, which I know lots of us have. Can also show up as resentment towards our parent for controlling us or whatever feelings we have towards it. And it can show up as constantly seeking approval from our authority figures. So that could mean that now with your boss, you always want your boss to sort of validate you that you're doing it right, especially if they're also a male. It could also be as seemingly unnoticeable as your male friends who are in more powerful positions, whether that is being shown through money or their job titles. It could also come through the owner of the coffee shop that you go to. There's just something within your body that kind of makes you want that person to approve of you. And it can be really subtle and kind of seemingly random, but this might be why. And then ultimately, there might be a little bit of struggle with decision making and forming healthy boundaries because of all of this. Second is the emotionally unavailable father. So a child whose father was emotionally distant or unavailable may struggle with feelings of inadequacy, not being chosen, and this a deep longing for emotional connection, right? So this can manifest as a difficulty expressing your emotions or seeking validation again, entering into relationships with partners who are going to replicate this emotional unavailability that definitely showed up in my life. Third, we have the abusive father. So if there is physical abuse happening in your childhood from a man, that is likely going to turn into low self-esteem. It could be self-blame, feelings of worthlessness, but also fear of men, fear of anger, developing coping mechanisms that could avoid relationships altogether because there is a deep lack of trust with you and masculine beings. Could form as extreme people pleasing because you really want to make sure that the person that you're relating to stays even keeled, that they're not triggered in any way, that they don't become emotional because it could cause you actual physical pain. And sometimes our psyches will even drive us to perpetuate this abusive behavior to ourselves as a result of internalizing that abuse and what it means about us, and maybe a deep-seated belief that we should be in pain or we should suffer or we should be punished. Definitely something to bring some compassion and presence and love to as you heal, if that's something you're experiencing. Number 4 is the absent father. So if we grew up without a father, there could be feelings of abandonment, obviously deep feelings of rejection. Similar to the abusive father, there can be a big difficulty forming and trusting relationships with men, fear of intimacy, and more, and again, seeking validation and approval from others as a way to try and fill this void left by a father's absence. So that will likely show up more with trying to get approval from men in all sorts of ways, like the examples I gave before, whether it's your coffee shop barista or your boss. You just want someone to sort of validate your existence, especially a man, because that wasn't inherent in your childhood, even though it's important for a child to have that role model. Next, we have the perfectionist father. So a daughter with a perfectionist father, as you can imagine, may feel a constant pressure to be meeting really unrealistic standards. And that is going to create in the body anxiety, beliefs about inadequacy, probably a fear of failure or your own perfectionism, right? You're just mirroring that level of intensity and pressure that your dad put on himself. So you find yourself striving for these unattainable goals, always needing more, always wanting maybe more education, more titles, bigger job role, more income, and parallel to that, experiencing really intense self-criticism. if you fall short. That can become like a really mean voice in our mind. And actually, there's two threads I'm noticing my mind wanting to go off in this direction. So I wouldn't put my dad in the perfectionist category, but I would definitely put him in the hard-working high achiever category. My dad is a farmer, and farmers work when the sun shines, like when there's daylight, basically. So in the summer hours, he's working incredibly long days, like up at the crack of dawn, literally working till dark, which in Canada could be as late as 9 or 10 p.m. So hardworking was drilled into me for sure. And in my first business, when I first started to become self-employed, I was actually in the marketing space. I was doing social media and online marketing and business coaching for solopreneurs. And after a few years of that, I had completely burned myself out. And I realized there was kind of a come to Jesus moment where I saw that I had built that mostly to try and prove something to him. And while it was still fun for me and it gave me all the freedom that I wanted, I realized that there was this huge need for validation that was coming from that. And that is probably one of the reasons that I worked myself so hard to the point where I was actually sick, very, very ill for 18 months and had all of these burnout symptoms, and my cortisol was completely shot. And then I experienced something called topical steroid withdrawal. So I basically had eczema symptoms all over my body, my neck, my eyes. I was peeling scabs off my body, you guys, like the size of a dime for months. And it was really hectic. And I'm not saying, oh my God, that's, my dad caused this or necessarily, but it was because I was driving myself into the ground, unconsciously seeking validation that I actually probably wasn't going to get in the way that I wanted it to, or I would receive it and it didn't even mean anything because part of me deeper believed that I wouldn't get it. Hopefully that makes sense. So let me give the example where, let's say, what I'm doing unconsciously is trying to get validation from my dad, and then I'm getting validation from this person and that person, and the money and the clients are having good experiences, but none of it is actually filling the void of what I want it to fill unless it comes from him. But then sometimes we start to get this validation from our fathers and it still doesn't feel right because our belief is so deep that we are not going to get it. So maybe that's something that I can unpack later as we go through these examples, but I hope sharing that was relatable. And now I have lost whatever the second thread on this was, so I trust that it will come back. Number 6 is the distant intellectual father. And this is really interesting because I experienced this with one of my exes and his parents, who both had PhDs. They were in the scholar field for their whole lives. And it was a phenomenon that I had never really saw, and so I didn't really consider it. But in this case, a daughter whose father is intellectually oriented but emotionally distant may just feel really disconnected from him on an emotional level, right? So they might have good conversations about politics or science or business or whatever is relevant. And maybe because of his intellectualness, he can also provide a lot of material support, but the daughter's likely left yearning for emotional connection and nurturing. And this is probably a good example where the dad, the father, the man himself can be a really kind provider or a really smart provider, let's say, but there's just this coldness and this lack of softening and openness that any child, but that a woman and a female wants to feel connected, feel the sense of presence from her dad and a sense of care and safety, maybe. It depends on the situation. So this might show up for us as a sense of emptiness or loneliness despite having our own success or our own academic achievement, which again might be driven consciously or unconsciously by the intellectual success of the father. It can still leave us feeling like I didn't do enough, or I still feel empty, or I still feel lonely because that need is still not being met. Number 7 is the conditionally loving father. So a daughter whose father's love was conditional upon her achievements or behavior is probably going to struggle with some deep-seated fear of rejection because everything was about performing, right? Performing, getting it right, doing something, accomplishing something. And so if that is what's at risk constantly in order to get love, then there's going to be a fear of getting it wrong all the time. And this can lead to deeper feelings then of unworthiness, the constant need to prove yourself in order to get the love and the acceptance that we should get unconditionally. And this woman is likely going to develop a pattern of seeking validation through external accomplishments, often at the expense of her own well-being. And as I'm reading this, I'm like, wait, maybe this sounds like more like me. And I think they were both there. As I said, my dad has a very high value for hard work, and in some ways that has paid off so much for me. And in some ways, the way that a man works hard is just not aligned with how a female body, female hormones should work, plus just general his own internalized need to work hard is probably something that has taken a tax on his body as well. So the eighth example is an enmeshed relationship. And enmeshment is where the lines are a little bit blurry between adult and child. So this could come in the case of the mother passing away and the daughter taking on this role of caretaker of the house, maybe making the meals for the father or the kids. That could create like a enmeshment. Also a divorce where the dad is really confiding in you, maybe complaining about the mom, for example. That can create enmeshment. So the boundaries are blurred, and this will cause us to feel responsible for the emotional well-being of our father. And that's going to hinder our own ability to develop a sense of self-dependence. It might show up as, oh, I need to be living by my dad. I need to be taking care of my dad. I need to sort of compensate for my dad or his emotions. Like, let's say you're planning a family event and you hear yourself saying, well, dad's going to need this or dad's going to want that and dad, da, da, da. And it's all about dad being pleased, basically. And that will further probably to create some guilt when you are asserting your own needs or your own desires. So kind of feeling trapped in that role of caretaker rather than being able to focus on your own growth and development and feeling like your dad is a pillar of support for that. Instead, he might feel like someone who needs and takes. So those are my examples. It might be a good time to take a deep breath if you notice that you are clenching, holding your stomach in, even holding your breath. Let's just sigh that out. And maybe you're like, oh my God, I'm all of them, or I'm like half of these. But what's important about it is that when we start to see these patterns, sometimes that in itself is really freeing, right? Because we now have this extra level of context of, okay, my dad is just acting out his trauma and his wounds that were created in his childhood, and that doesn't mean it's fair, that doesn't mean it's right, especially in the case of abuse, but it does sort of create this bigger picture that it's not only about me. It's not me that did something wrong and me that's inherently bad. He's also a human and was probably a pretty young human when you were born who is learning and growing as well. So we can see these patterns, we see where they come from, and from there we get to unpack them and how and where they are stored in our own body. And then we get to heal and work with that, which for me, as I said, really comes through the body, right? I've been talking about this over and over. So what we need to do is we need to map and track these patterns when they start to play out. And then when we add the body level of understanding, how it feels in the body, what survival response do I go into, that will help us to interrupt the pattern. And I'm going to give you a few examples. But before we go deeper into that, I want to offer you something called a free association prompt. This can be really illuminating as well when we consider not just our fathers, but how we feel about men in general, how we feel about the masculine. Because if we want to have a deep, connected, healthy, mature love, then we have to have a deep, connected, healthy, mature relationship with the masculine within us. We all have feminine and masculine energy within us, and with the general masculine of the world. And when we look at the world, that can feel like a really big reach. But the more that we have a healed relationship to the masculine, the more we'll see it in the world and the more it will come into our life. Okay? So, as I said, we're going to do this little exercise. I'm going to say a sentence and your mind will fill in the blank. It will automatically fill in the blank. So I'm going to say this sentence and I'm going to leave a couple seconds and you just notice what comes to mind. Then I'm going to say the start of the sentence again, something else will come to mind. I'll say it again, something else will come to mind. And I'll probably do that 10 times. And I just want you to notice what your mind and what your subconscious is automatically sending to the top of your brain, okay? And then after, I'll give you some examples, some things that have come up for me in the past, and we'll be able to go through it. So, focusing in here, your prompt is, men are. Men are. Men are. Men are. Men are. Men are. It's okay if you repeat. It's okay if you can't think of some. Men are. A judgment I have about men is that they are. A judgment I have about men is that they are. Men are. Men are. Men are. We're gonna pause it there. So another deep breath, another sigh. Could be a good time to pause and just reflect a little bit on what came up. How did it feel for you? For me, for example, the first one that comes to my mind is usually men are assholes. And that is something that I directly heard from one of my family members multiple times. And so, of course, that's what's in my subconscious. Then I also hear men are scared of their emotions. Men are cocky. Men are insecure. And I also come to men are kind. Men are powerful. Men are well-intending. Men are tired. Men are scared. Men are burnt out. Men are unsure. And so our mind starts to feed us these beliefs, right? And the ones that we want to look closer at are the ones that really, kind of enliven something in your body or feel almost like you want to wince because it sounds so bad and you think, oh my God, I can't believe I actually thought that. I can't believe that judgment came up in me, because somewhere we do have that living within us. And if my core beliefs are that men are disgusting and insecure and cocky and scared, then that's something that I need to look at before I can create healthy relationships with especially new men in my life, because that's the baseline that I'm going in. And so if I was doing this exercise with you one-on-one, there would be a lot of different directions that we would probably unpack here. But what I can say is that if you're looking to form a more healthy relationship with the masculine in general, what we can start by doing is identifying where we do have safe relationships with men. And the caveat here is what sometimes happens is when we're not used to safety with men, we continue to find ourselves in dynamics with unsafe men, because on some layer, it's what we're used to, it's what's comfortable, it's where we think we should be, it's that we think we have to take care of them and we think we have to fix them. And so we become drawn to the same type of man that causes us a similar type of pain. So in order to start to rewire that, we have to find actual evidence and start to consciously create evidence within our experiences that allow us to see where it can and it might be different. And the more that we see that, the more that we open ourselves up to more of that, because if my belief is now, men are kind, men are powerful, men have my best interest in mind, men protect me without any need for any sort of sexual exchange is what I'm getting at. I feel like there's a word. Then I start to feel a lot more relaxed around the masculine. I start to feel like I can be supported in small ways by the masculine without having to owe them anything. I know that's such a huge one for women, and this is another topic in itself. But the takeaway here is to look for the evidence where men are what you want them to be: healthy, safe, kind, etc. So let's give a specific example where we kind of break it down start to finish on how to take one of these patterns that you notice is happening in yourself and the limiting belief or behavior that it's creating, and then creating resolution. So say you notice that you tend to be drawn towards men who are charming and successful in their career, but emotionally distant. And these are men who now you can clearly see, if you didn't know before, are mirroring the behavior of your father. It's like, oh shit. So what we want to do is first, it's probably going to need to be something that is actually uncomfortable or not working, right? So I noticed that I was definitely attracted to emotionally unavailable men. And even though on some level the initial attraction felt so good, not too long down the line, I would people please, lose myself, be a chameleon, be completely needless, then be in pain, then be resentful, never get commitment, and then end up going through a breakup. So I saw how that started to play out, and I started to see the pattern. what we need to do is track the thoughts, the emotions, and the bodily sensations that arise during the attraction of this interaction. So you might notice that there is tension in your chest or tension in your stomach. Maybe your breathing becomes more shallow, or there's a sense of actually unease when you're around emotionally unavailable men. And I don't want to burst a bubble here, but sometimes this is what that butterfly feeling is. It feels like, oh, I'm needed here. I'm supposed to be here. This is right. This is a match for me. While at the same time, it can actually be your body telling you, like, I'm on edge, I'm going into my hypervigilant mode, I'm very aware of this person, and I feel like I need them to validate me, so I need to be very activated. So now you're recognizing the survival response that kicks in, as we said before. It might be the shallow breathing or a sense of nervousness even, and then we look at, okay, what are the behaviors that I start to do when I'm interacting with this type of person? Maybe you overcompensate by trying to please the other person. Maybe you go into this performative mode. Maybe you find yourself oversharing. Maybe you find yourself talking a lot about money and success specifically because that's what you think he wants to talk about, or that his life is about business. This is where we start to lose ourselves. We start to turn into a mode and turn it on in order to please or get validation from this person. But now that you have this awareness, you can see these things happening in real time, or you notice after you get home from a date that you were like, I did that thing. I went into that mode. And from there, we just have to practice bringing our attention back to our body, to centering ourselves, to regulating ourselves, and then to making decisions about the dynamic from there. Is this a dynamic I actually want to be in, or do I just want to win this person's validation because I think it's going to feel good for me, even though I actually know he's a partner that I would never marry, for example? And the more you get good at this, with a deeper understanding of your patterns, the easier it will become to set boundaries around this and to ultimately just not feel attracted to those situations that you know are going to play out like that. And I'm not saying it goes down to zero, because I've worked extensively with this, or with these themes, the ones that match for me. And I have still started dating people like this. And I've been like, oh, maybe I know better now, so like it won't be the same. And it's still the same. I think I told this story in one of the podcast episodes. And even now, I can sometimes pick out the people that I know would be a match for that wound, that would give me that feeling of, oh, I need to show up for this person. Oh, I need to perform for this person, because it's just based on the other person's, their nervous system, their patterns, their beliefs, how they show up in the world. And our body will have a memory for that, especially if we've been practicing it for 25 years. But when I can feel what's going on, then I can create distance around that person, can make sure my boundaries are clear around that person, make sure I'm not creating or letting myself go into any weird energetic thing that's just not going to feel good. And that takes a lot of self-awareness and a lot of discipline and also practice. And that's what you are cultivating here. And when we have that, then from the beginning, we start to feel more safe to communicate our needs and our expectations in this clear, loving, but assertive way. And we can recognize when it's necessary to walk away from relationships that aren't going to serve our emotional well-being, which is the important thing. And it's important to be able to be clear on that in the beginning of a relationship to really save ourselves pain down the line, because we are more likely to go into this self-abandoning, lose ourselves in the beginning when that initial lust and connection and chemistry is really high. That's when we're going to start to slip on those boundaries, right? So we just have to be clear. I am in the dating world, or you are in the dating world. I'm not. I'm in a relationship, but I'm in this because I want commitment and I want it to be like this. And this is what my expectations are. And when we feel solid in those, then we are minimizing the risk of going into an overcompensating mode or performative mode. And ultimately, what I want to say is that this journey really requires us to be gentle with ourselves and compassionate with ourselves, because as I said, there is something in the core of your being that may be attracting you to men who are mimicking the less than ideal patterns that were taught to you by your father. That's just the reality of our subconscious and our psyche. And it can be a bit frustrating to be like, why do I keep falling in love with these guys who are mimicking the pain that was caused to me by my dad? I know it sounds a little messed up. It doesn't mean it was all bad or anything like that, but we just have to give ourselves grace along the way and recognize that healing is a process and it's okay to stumble and celebrating any progress where you do open, where you do speak your truth, where you do feel safe, and the courage it takes to transform these deep-seated patterns. If you want to unpack this even further in a bit of a slow, connected way where you can really highlight your own journey and your own experience with your father, then I have paired this episode with a series of exercises that live in my Becoming Secure community. You've probably heard me talk about it before. That is a low-cost membership space where you get a ton of extra trainings that I've made, a lot of guided somatic practices. There's one that went up last week that was about self-compassion, which is important for this whole journey. And now these exercises on healing the father wound will be in there. The pricing changes as more people are added because there's more people for me to support, right? So up until 50 members, the price is $20 a month. After 50, it's going to increase to $30 a month. And then thereafter, it will continue to increase as more people go in. But whatever cost you sign up for will be your price forever. And right now there are 44 members, I'm pretty sure. So that means there's going to be 6 spots at the $20 rate, and then it's going to go up to the $30 rate. Either way, I've tried to make it an absolute no-brainer. I coach you there through the discussions that we have. There's new content every single week, and there are lots of actual guided practices for you to go through that are body-based and somatic-based, and it's just a wealth of tools and insights and strategies to actually work with and heal this stuff on the deeper levels. So I hope to see you in there. And one more note, at the time of this recording, I'm about to start my second round of Secure Love for the year. The doors are probably closed by the time I publish this, but because I have a live group going and all of the 44 plus women that are in Becoming Secure, I probably won't be able to put an episode out for a month, let's say, because I really want to support those people. So if you want to deepen, as I said, head into Becoming Secure. The doors are open. I will also be supporting the women in Secure Love, which I'm happy to talk to you about if you're interested in the next round. And until then, I'm just sending you so much love and encouragement, and know that I'm here for you and you're doing amazing. Links, as always, are directly in the show notes. Go take action on those now if you're interested so you don't forget. And I'll talk to you soon. Ciao, ciao.